In this video, we get an introduction to Spring Boot. Spring in a nutshell. Spring's a very popular framework for building Java applications. It provides a large number of helper classes and annotations. But now the problem is that building a traditional Spring application is really hard because you have a couple of questions. Which jar dependencies do I need for this Spring project? How do I set up configuration? Should I use XML configuration or Java configuration? How do I install the server, Tomcat, JBoss, WebSphere, and so on? And that's just the basics for getting started. You haven't even really started building your real application yet. So this is where the Spring Boot solution comes into play. Spring Boot makes it easier to get started with Spring development. It minimizes the amount of manual configuration you have to do. Spring Boot will perform the auto configuration based on your properties file and the jar class path. And it also helps to resolve dependency conflicts. And Spring Boot also provides an embedded HTTP server so you can get started quickly. So out of the box, it has support for embedded Tomcat, Jetty, or Undertow. And those are simply HTTP servers that you can embed in your Spring Boot application. Now, what's the relationship between Spring Boot and Spring? Well, Spring Boot uses Spring behind the scenes. Spring Boot simply makes it easier to use Spring. So at a very high level, you're using Spring Boot, but behind the scenes, there's still Spring code running. So you'll need to learn Spring Boot and also learn Spring, and we'll cover all of that during this course. Now, Spring Boot provides the Spring Initializer. So this is a website for quickly creating a starter Spring project. So basically, you go to this website at start.spring.io, you simply select your dependencies, and then it'll actually create a Maven or Gradle project for you that you can download and import it into your IDE. So you can import it into Eclipse, IntelliJ, NetBeans, or so on, or you could just use a plain text editor and use Maven at the command line, and then you're A-OK and ready to go. And we'll actually use Spring Initializer a lot in some of the following videos with setting up our Spring Boot project. So you'll get a lot of hands-on practice with this. So Spring Boot provides an embedded HTTP server so you can get started quickly. So it has support for Tomcat, Jetty, and Undertow. So again, like I mentioned earlier, there's no need to install a server separately. So basically, you'll have your application like mycoolapp.jar. So this jar file will include your application code, and it'll also include the embedded server. So you'll have Tomcat that's embedded as part of your jar file. So the nice thing about this is that it's a self-contained unit. There's nothing else that you have to install. So there's no separate Tomcat installation you need or JBoss installation or whatever. You actually have the application server as part of your code, and you can run it independently, or you can run your application standalone. All right, so this is kind of a good segue in here for this next slide. So basically, we can run our apps standalone because our apps include the embedded server. So if I wanted to run my Spring Boot app, I could run it from the IDE, or I could run it from the command line. So again, we have this mycoolapp.jar that includes my code and also the embedded server, in this case Tomcat. So at my command line, I could simply type java-jar and give the name of my jar file. So in this case, mycoolapp.jar, and it'll actually run my application, and it'll also spin up the server, and my app is up and running by running in a standalone fashion. Okay, so then you're probably wondering, all right, well, that's cool to kind of run it as just a jar file, but my manager wants me to deploy our applications in a traditional way. Like my manager wants me to deploy a WAR file. Well, no problem. Spring Boot apps can also be deployed in the traditional fashion. So you can deploy a WAR file to an external server like Tomcat, JBoss, or WebSphere, and it can work just like you would use it in the past. All right, so here we have this Tomcat server. Let's say it's deployed somewhere on your corporate network. Then you could simply take your Spring Boot app, and then you can deploy that Spring Boot app as a WAR file with a .war extension. So now as a WAR file, you only have your code included. There's no need to have the embedded server because now you're deploying it in a traditional sense. There's already a Tomcat server installed running elsewhere, and we're simply deploying our WAR file to that server. So that piece is fine. And then also on that Tomcat server, there may be other project teams that are deploying their apps in the traditional way too. So you can have the travel team deploying their travel WAR, the e-commerce group or the shopping group deploying their WAR. So you can take your Spring Boot app and you can also deploy it as a WAR file to a traditional server like you did in the past. So there's always some frequently asked questions that I get regarding Spring Boot. So I just wanted to kind of address them here just so you can kind of, see what they're about. So the first question is, does Spring Boot replace Spring MVC, Spring REST, etc.? And the answer is no. So there's no competition here. Instead, Spring Boot actually uses those technologies in the background. So you have your Spring Core, you have your Spring AOP, Spring MVC, Spring REST. Spring Boot can use all of those technologies in the background. So there's no competition. There's no replacement. All right. So Spring Boot is mainly about configuration. So once you do your Spring Boot configs, then you can make use of the regular Spring coding. So there's no competition. There's no replacement. Again, Spring Boot is really about helping you get started quickly with minimal configuration. And the next question I get a lot is, does the Spring Boot code run faster than regular Spring code? And again, the answer is no, because behind the scenes, Spring Boot uses the same code of the Spring framework. And so like I said earlier, Spring Boot is all about making it easier to get started by minimizing the configuration. But behind the scenes, you have your normal Spring Core, Spring REST, Spring MVC, and so on. And then the other question I get a lot is, do I need a special IDE for Spring Boot? And again, the answer is no. You can use any IDE for Spring Boot apps. You can even use a plain text editor. The Spring team actually provides a free Spring Tool Suite, STS, which is basically a collection of IDE plugins. And some IDEs provide fancy Spring tooling support, so it's not a requirement. So feel free to use the IDE that works best for you. Or you could simply use Maven, the command line, and a plain text editor. Totally up to you. All right, so that was just a quick introduction. In the following videos, we'll kind of dive a bit deeper into Spring Boot. So I'll see you in the next video.